Okay, we are studying the topic, does God exist? This is one of the most common questions that atheists, or even people who doesn't want God in their life, ask, thinking that there's no way we could prove. By the way, maybe next time I will tell you, but because I said this, God cannot be proven, neither can he be disproved. That's the kind of thing the world would accept. So you can't literally say, yes, he is there. At the same time, you can't even disprove him because he is beyond human imagination or human element. But at the same time, we have enough evidence to show that God exists. Okay, the outline evidence against the existence of God. If you remember, if there's any one of you who have not gone through the part one and part two, I would suggest after this session, please go on to my YouTube, Pastor Mohan Rao Abadasari, and watch those two parts so that you will have better understanding of what we are talking about today as well. So first part we studied against the existence, then is belief in God irrational. Today we will look at the arguments for the evidence of God. Next week, we will look at the biblical evidence. And very important question the following week, if God created the universe, then who created God? This is where most of the atheists argue about. So we'll look at that. And finally, there's so many gods. How can you say there's only one God? We will look at that as well. In the arguments against the existence of God, we looked at empirical, deductive, inductive, subjective arguments. Empirical, just for a minute. If God is there, why is there so much evil? If God is there, why is there so much pointless evil? If God is there, why is there so much inconsistency within the same religion or among the religions or among Christianity? So there's so many discrepancies that make people believe God is one. If God is real, how can there be differences among themselves? And if God is there, why is there so much of innocent lifestyle? All those kinds of things. Last week we looked at is belief in God irrational? Many think people who believe in God, they say they don't want to use their brains. They just want to hang on to something. But there's four possible questions or reality. Reality is an illusion. Reality is or was self-created. Reality is self-existent. Reality was created by something that is self-existent. Last week we did look at all these four and come to conclusion reality must be created and it must be self-existent if it were to be believed on. Okay, today we will look at the evidence for God. This is not again from Bible. Next week will be biblical evidence. I'm trying not to put Bible in the first place so that we can first find out evidence through reasoning, rationalism, and then through the world around, so that finally, when we come to Bible, we know why we believe in that. So when it comes to evidence for God, there are four major arguments. There are so many, but at least four major arguments for evidence. One is called ontological argument, which means the argument from being. The next is called teleological argument, which means the argument from design.
You're gonna give him the what?
The third one is called cosmological argument, that is the argument from the universe, cosmology. And finally, moral argument, that is the argument from moral order, moral order. So these are not biblical arguments, but these are generally accepted arguments in philosophy, in science, in any thought when we think of the world, the universe, and God, and supernatural power, all these things. These are the major four arguments. Let's see if God makes sense through these arguments. The first one is called ontological argument, or the argument from being. Now, this argument was coined by by Saint Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the 11th century. That's when this argument came into light. What it says is this is an attempt to prove that God is a necessary being with every positive attribute, infinitely powerful, wise, and good. There is still much interest in it in even modern times. but we will go through it a bit more. What does Anselm come up with? Anselm defines God as being greater than which nothing can be thought. That means he says God must be something greater than, there's nothing else you can think beyond that. By greater, he meant more perfect, looking at the human life and all. However, if the object of this idea only existed in our mind, we could frame an idea of something superior to it. What does that mean? He's trying to say, okay, if God is greater than anything that you could think of, and God is someone whom we cannot see, have not seen, could it be that he's only existed in our mind, but in reality is not there? We could frame an idea of something superior to it because we haven't seen it. But going on to his conclusions, this being would be a being with all the perfections of the idea we had framed, but with the improvement of actually existing in reality. In other words, you frame in your mind that there is a supreme being who is good, who is perfect, who is holy, who is, I mean, your imagination can go to any extent because you want this being to be above human weaknesses, human character, something that you really idealize. So he's saying it is there. But if he only exists there and if he's not a real thing, it can't be. But he's saying if he's truly that perfect being that I picture in my mind, he must be also a reality. It therefore follows, according to this argument, that God must exist in reality. The concept of a most perfect being that we have must include real existence. That means, what's the point of thinking of such a being? You picture such a great being, perfect, powerful, whatever other things, but in reality, it's just an imagination. So he's saying it's good to think of a being who is beyond imagination, who is great, whatever you think, but if that being is not in real, then it cannot be. So he must exist in reality. That's what. So any conceptualization of a being greater than which nothing can be thought must include real existence as one of its qualities. Existence belongs to the nature of the most perfect being. So again, it's simply saying that he must exist if he's there. Next slide. So what, by definition, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. This is a philosophical and definition. Who is God? He by definition the most and the greatest conceivable being that you could even think of. God exists at least in the understanding. We understand this definition. That means though people have not seen, at least in some understanding, God does exist. A God that existed in reality would be better than the one who existed merely in the understanding. That means if you only imagine God existed, but you do not know if he really exists. But if there is a God who really existed, the God who exists in reality is greater than the one who just exists in your mind or in your understanding. So suppose that God doesn't exist in reality, but only in the understanding, then what happens? Then we could conceive of a being greater than God, namely a real God. That means if there's no God really in existence, but he's only existing in your mind, you just think of such a great being. That defeats the purpose, saying that that means there must be somebody greater than that being that you pictured in your mind who could be a real being. So there won't be any full stop for your imagination of where you want the reality to come by. But when we could conceive of something greater than the greatest conceivable being, just sorry about that. Okay. So, but then we could conceive of something greater than the greatest conceivable being from one, because God is the greatest conceivable being. Since that is contradictory, the supposition 4 must be false, because what 4 says, suppose that God doesn't exist in reality. I don't know if you are understanding, this is a bit too much, but therefore God exists in reality as well as understanding. That means the conclusion of this philosophy is this: if you think of God being a great person, but he's only in your mind, in your understanding, he's not real, then it defeats the purpose of even thinking of a being. The fact that you're thinking there is a greater being and it is the laws of the nature, you see things exist, he must exist and he is. So he must be not only in your understanding, he must be real as well. That's the only way you can say God exists. Let me go a little more simplifying. It is possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. That means if you think there is a possibility God exists, then he must then he must be existing. Then they say God is maximally great being. In the light of philosophy and all, if you think of there is a God, he must be the maximum great being. Maximally means the highest that you could think of. That's the thing he must be. So if something were greater than God, then that being would be God. Why do they say God? If God exists, he must be maximally great being, because he's the highest. But if there is something higher than God, then that which is higher than God becomes the God, not this one, because he is not greater than the greatest that you could even imagine. So what are they saying? In order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all powerful, all knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. That means the universe is too big. We don't know where God exists. Let's not, I'm telling, we're not talking about Bible now. So in some possible world, maybe God existing. If he exists, he must be maximally great. And what are some of the qualities? If he has to be maximally great, he must be all powerful, he must be knowing everything, and he must be morally perfect. That's what makes God God. So he must be existing somewhere with these qualities. So what does possible worlds mean? Um, possible world is a complete and consistent way the world is or could have been. I mean, in our mind, possible world, the world that is complete, or the world that we think is complete enough, we might have not seen it yet, or we are just in our mind, we think of that complete world. For example, unicorns do not exist in actual world, but it is possible that they could have in possible world. People come up with unicorns. We have never seen. I don't know how they can, but because you could imagine anything, maybe they would have existed in some possible world. Just because you don't see now doesn't mean that they don't exist. That's the argument. Just because you don't see God doesn't mean he doesn't exist, because there are so many things that we don't see, and yet our mind says they might be existing. Another argument in that line: a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world. Why is that? Because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. If you're married, you're not a bachelor. You may say, well, I don't live with my wife, so I'm like a bachelor. No, bachelor means you're not married. Whether you live or not is a secondary thought. So it could not possibly exist. There's no way married bachelor would exist, because it doesn't logically agree with the definition itself. So that's what it means. So what are we saying then? It is possible that a maximally great being exists with, this is what the science or philosophy says. There is a possibility from this argument of being, he must is existing. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That means if this person exists in some possible world that I have not seen, I'm not aware of, there must be an evidence, or then he must exist in actual world. Why? Because God is maximally great, all powerful, all knowing. He transcends time and space. So if you only confine him to some world, and he's only God of some place but not of the earth, then he can't be great. He can't be maximally great. So if your mind says there is a maximally great God existing in some possible world, and if you think that could be possible, then you must also think he must also be possible in actual world. Actual world means our world, which we can feel and see. That also must be a reality if that would be so. So that's what it means. So if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. I'm sorry, I put it twice. A maximally great being exists in the actual world. So that brings the conclusion. So he must exist in the actual world. So therefore, a maximally great being exists. That means he exists. I don't know if I've confused more than making it clarity, but the concept is the ontological argument, saying argument from being. Everything, we are beings, we are alive, we can feel. This is a reality, and there must be a reality beyond human minds can see. And if that reality does exist, it must be real in my world as well. I think that's the way simple. That's the simple way to put it. The second argument for God is called teleological argument, which means the argument from design. I think this is more relevant to us because we see it, we understand this better. The basic premise of all teleological argument from the existence of God is that the world exhibits an intelligent, listen to this, the world exhibits what? Intelligent, purpose based on experience from nature, such as its order, unity, coherency, design, and complexity. Any one of us who take time to observe nature, look at the complexity in it, look at the purpose of things and the design that we see and the order that is around, how on earth can somebody say it just popped up like that? The design is another clear evidence that is in the world to show there must be, if there is a design, there must be what? A designer. A designer. So this argument says if you see a design in the world, there must be a designer. For example, since the universe displays such an amazing design, there must have been a divine designer.
The 3-on diesel just had one of our turbo systems in.
There must be a designer. For example, as we said last time, some time ago, if the earth were significantly close or further away from the sun, it would not be capable of supporting much of the life it currently does. If the elements in our atmosphere were even a few percentage points different, nearly every living thing on earth would die. As we said last time, the way the earth was arranged, put in its place from to the distance of the sun, even if it was slightly closer to the sun or even further from the sun, by heat or by cold, the life would have been extinguished from this earth. Exactly where life is possible, it is there. For all these years, it has not moved, it has not changed. You think it's just by chance that life exists and the position of how it is? Any thinking person could not say it just happened like that. There was a design, there was a purpose, because we see the purpose of life existing by the way the earth was positioned in our solar system. Also, some of these men, at least two of these great scholars, they say, though they don't believe in God much, they have arguments against. Look at what Socrates says. With such signs of forethought in the design of living creatures, you can doubt they are the work of design. What is he saying? When you see so much of design in the living creatures, how can you even doubt? You can doubt they are the work of design. That means he said, can you really doubt that this is not the work of a design? Because look at the way, the order, the complexity, the purpose, and the providence and the beauty. How can that be just by chance? Another scholar says, what would be more obvious when we look up to contemplate the heavens, that there is some divine divinity or intelligence. The more you observe the universe, study it, the more they're fascinated about the order, the complexity, and every other aspect of it. And they wonder, how can this just come as just like that? Of course, in the Bible, heavens declare that there is a purpose why the heavens are made. But we will look at that later. But the appearance of design is a great evidence for God. In the design, this is one area where people think, well, it just happened or whatever. There's one thing that scientists cannot even today prove or say, how can this be? Is this called anthropic principle? Anthropos means man. That means something that is associated with man. What does that mean? modern cosmologists have identified not less than, listen to this one, 40 measurable characteristics of the universe. Each of these are fine-tuned to such great degree that moving one of them in either directly only a fraction of a percentage would make the existence of life anywhere in the universe impossible. We just spoke about the sun, or the position of the earth to the sun, but there are at least 40 measurable characters that the scientists identified that are in its order, that are designed, put in a place where if you move them, how much? Only a fraction of a percentage. I don't know what that means. In other words, very slight movement, it says the life on the universe would be impossible. For example, gravitational force and electromagnetic. I'm not a science student to explain these things. Maybe you should look at them and see how these two make a difference, if they were moved or they are changed from their composition or whatever. So these are two just examples of 40 things that the scientists identified that says that, there is a purpose attached. The conclusion of modern cosmology is that the universe, look at what they concluded. After studying these 40 measurable characters, their conclusion is, the conclusion of modern cosmology is that the universe appears to have had man in mind. That means when this universe came into existence, it looks like the life of man was in mind, because every measurable 40 of these things are there to support man's life, to promote man's habitation on this planet. It looks like that the whole universe is set up on anthropic principle. That means purpose for man, for existence for man. That's what they concluded, because they can't even find how it could be just random like that. Now, of course, in the Bible, it says, look at, this is an amazing text. For thus says the Lord God, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it. Look at it, says next part, who did not create in vain. According to evolution theory or Darwinian theory, how did the world come into existence? Just like that. There's no purpose attached, there's no meaning, it just happened. But look at what the Bible says. Did God just create it for the sake of creation, just for fun? No, look at what the scripture says, who did not create it in vain. That means there was a purpose why he created, who formed it to be what? Inhabited, so that it could be habited. I am the Lord and there is no other. Next week, we will see more of this evidence, but just to give a bit of a thrust to what the philosophy of the science are saying, you can find the answer. Now, we all know this man, this book, The God Delusion. I'm sure people who read it believed so much. People who had a Christian background also left faith reading him. But if you read that book closely and try to critique what he actually means by what he says, you will be shocked. Some of the things that he said, it doesn't make sense. And yet people believe, because it's easy to get rid of God than to believe and be held accountable. So a few things that he said, maybe let's look at. On his book, God Delusion, page 57 and 157 and 58, Richard Dawkins encapsulates the central argument of his book in 6 points. We're not going to put all this as he said, but just for argument, what actually he means. Look at one of his statements. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. So what is he saying? One thing that he is still puzzled. How did this complexity of design come into existence? He doesn't answer that, but he poses that question. The natural temptation. So how do you answer this? So he says the natural temptation to answer that is to attribute the appearance of design to an actual design itself. In the case of man-made artifacts such as watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. So in other words, he's trying to compare the universe design with a man-made, for example, watch. Saying all of us have watch. Watch is designed by a designer. But he's saying you can't use that argument for the world. Look at what he says. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing. a spider or a person. He's saying, I'm tempted to give the same argument for the things I see, but he doesn't want to, because if he does it, then he has to accept there is a designer. So he says it can. Then he actually gives a reason why he is not tempted to give the same logic that there is a designer behind a watch that is designed. He gives a reason. Look at this. The temptation is a false one. Why? Because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. Why he is not allowing to allow, or why he is not willing to give the same argument that there's a designer behind a watch to the eye, to the human, or to the universe? Because when he says there's a designer behind the design, he could feel the designer, he could see the designer. Okay, that is man. But if he puts the same logic to the design, that there is a designer behind the universe who created my eye and all these complexities, then he's tempted to ask who created the designer. When it comes to human design, if suppose this watch is made by me, there's a designer called Mohan. And you can't stop there. Who created Mohan? There's his father, there is his grandfather, great great grandfather. So there is a tangible evidence of a designer that you can say in the design that man made. But he says when it comes to God, you can't say that. If you say God is the one who designed, then who designed God? And if you ask that question, he says there's no answer. So therefore, I don't want to use that logic that there is a designer behind a design. Some more Darwinian evolution. He also advocates for Darwinian evolution, which later time we will study that in detail as well. After we complete this, we will look at creation versus evolution and look at those facts as well. Darwinian evolution by natural selection offers the greatest, most powerful explanatory scope so far discovered in the biological science. Look at he has some issues with Darwinian theory, but in one area he is not questioning is that when it comes to biological science, Darwinian theory is basically based on biological science. Darwinian observed. I will talk about Darwinian when it comes to creationism. He observed. He's a biology student, traveled so many countries, observed species before he made his conclusions, and most of his conclusions seems to be accurate when it comes to the scientific evidence. So he says it is possible for Darwinian theory because discovery is through the biological. Darwin and his success have shown how living creatures with their spectacular statistical improbability and appearance of design have evolved by slow. What was their outcome? All this design, everything took place by how? By slow, gradual degrees from simple beginnings. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that. It's an illusion. Why it's an illusion? It's a belief that you have to accept because there's nothing beyond that. You have to hold on to something. Actually, commenting on this, one of the Christian defenders of truth said, if even the Darwinian evolution, if you think like that, what is their main premise? Things evolved by slow, gradually through degrees, and then formed, and then whatever we think of. For example, is there anything that you can, one of the scholars says, for example, take some metal or take anything that you find, put it in your garage, for, just give me a second. Sorry about that. So this scholar says, suppose you have a garage at home. You throw some stuff. Mostly garages are used to leave stuff that we don't usually use. Not everybody, but at least people like me. Leave some rubbish there, things that you don't. And maybe leave it for how many years, as the science thinks that there's millions of years, whatever time. Can anybody in their right mind imagine all the metal that you threw there, all unnecessary things, after gradual slow process, they have become a beautiful car, or they have become some kind of something that is useful for man? he says anybody in their right mind could not even imagine that all the rubbish have turned out to be a beautiful car with the engine, with oil, with switch, and all things, gears, and the speed limits, and all kinds of gadgets. Can you even imagine? You leave your garage with all your junk, and after some thousands or millions of years, that just comes up like a car that you can drive that has some purpose. No, man have, at least from the time that we know, at least from biblical times, at least we know 6,000 years. This is anything that evolved that people can say yes, something did come out through gradual process. No, when we look at creation, Darwinian theory, we look at the years of why they speak of millions of years. But for now, it is not possible. So what he says, so we don't yet have an equivalent, well-grounded. So what Dawkins is saying is, at least for Darwinian theory, there is some evidence of biological sciences because they place their evidence, their conclusions or arguments based on biology. And one of the way they want to explain is evolution took place slowly, millions of years. But when it comes to the world, because Darwin mostly spoke about the life on this earth. Now, Richard Dawkins is saying, when it comes to the physical world, he says such an argument you can't even put it here. Look at how he's trying to dodge out. For design, he doesn't want to believe there's a designer. Even for Darwinian theory, he says that is only possible only through biological science. But when it comes to this metaphysical world, you can't apply the same logic, he says. Why? We don't yet have an equivalent, well-grounded explanatory model for physics. Some kind of multiverse theory could, in principle, do for physics the same explanatory work as Darwinian does for biology. This kind of explanation is superficially less satisfying than the biological version of Darwinianism. He's saying there must be some explanation for this physical world, but he's saying, what is he saying? It may be superficial, less satisfying because the evidence is not as good as the Darwinian theory, because it makes heavier demands on luck. Look what he's saying. But the anthropic principle entitles us to postulate for more luck than our limited human intuition is comfortable with. In other words, he's saying, I can't understand. Because the anthropic principle is what? Everything that God created seems to have, everything that is existing, the universe seems to have man in mind. The sun, the moon, the stars, the air, the oxygen, the universe, the earth. It is, so he's saying he can't explain, but that doesn't mean there is no explanation. But as of now, there's no explanation. You just have to believe. So we should not give up the hope. So look at his conclusions. We should not give up the hope of a well-grounded explanatory model arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. In other words, he's hoping that there will be some well-grounded explanation, just like Darwin, how he used biology to prove the Darwinian theory. So he's saying, hoping that there will be some explanation. But even in the absence of a strongly satisfying model to match the biological one, the relatively weak models we have at present are, when abetted by the anthropic principle, self-evidently better than the self-defeating God hypothesis of an intelligent desire. Finally, that's his conclusion. In other words, even if there is a weak argument for the existence of this universe, which you can't prove, which doesn't make sense, it is better than believing in a God who has designed this world. That's what he says. Because his main argument for God is, if you say God is the one who designed this world, then who designed God? Which we will study not next week, the following week. So that's why his conclusion says, though he can't give an answer, but he doesn't want to believe there is a designer behind the design. He acknowledges there's a design. He acknowledges that the design has a purpose in mind, that is for making the life of man. Yet he can't explain it, but at the same time, he doesn't want to believe there's a designer behind this. Now, Darwin himself, in spite of all the scientific evidence, biological evidence, and he brought about some of his conclusions. Look at one of his very striking statement. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances, could have been formed by natural selection, that is evolution, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So that means when he actually understood how complicated the eye is, how complex the eye is, how much intricacies it has. I mean, when you study the eye, he's amazed of its complexity. And his conclusion is, if you just say that it just formed by itself, he says, that kind of an understanding is what? He freely confesses it's absurd in the highest degree. He can't believe that could happen. And yet, he made some conclusions. So, teleological design, what are we saying? Atheist objects. For example, if you're an atheist, why do people seeing the design and yet they still deny? The argument from design suffers from the complaint that while the world is phenomenal, it is fraught with inexplicable natural catastrophes, from typhoons to tornadoes, sinkholes to tsunamis, which an atheist will use to point out that the world is not perfect. If you say there is God, He is all powerful, perfect, good, created, He is the designer. But what about the things that you see in the world that are chaotic? As much as there is evidence for design, there is also evidence for the chaos. Look at the kind of natural disasters that destroy human life. How on earth can you say there is a designer? Do you then say these are the designs of God? How can you define? So there must have been no God. They accept there is design, but they also say within the design there is also chaos. How do you put that one? So it is worth noting that here that the teleological argument doesn't posit that the world is perfect. But look at the argument from design is not saying that the world is perfect. That's what the atheists try to defend themselves. But the argument itself is not saying the world is perfect, but its creator is. That's the difference we must understand. Here referred to St. Augustine's poem Supra, then that what he refers it. That he allows for such vagaries of natural and nature and natural disasters is part of its unscrutable plan. And the fact that nature has not destroyed itself, but perdured despite man's attempts to destroy other man and the earth in the process, is attributed to God's perfection versus man's imperfection. As much as you see so much of natural disasters that destroyed life and so much of nature in many ways, nature never destroyed nature completely. So this argument is saying there must be a God behind this. So that's from design. Before I conclude, think of anything you see that is made or that is outside natural existence that came out of man. You will always see it is created by somebody. Nothing you can say just existed apart from the even nature. We don't create it. God created it. Okay, so the third one, cosmological argument. That means the argument from the universe. The universe itself has some evidence. Every effect must have a cause. That's the scientific theory. This universe and everything in it is an effect. That means whatever you see is an effect of something that caused it. There must be something that caused everything to come into existence. Ultimately, there must be something uncaused in order to cause everything else to come into existence. That uncaused cause is God. That means the science believe for every effect there is a cause. Without a cause, there is no effect. And if you ask something caused it, and if you there is something that must be the cause of everything that existed, then which caused? It's almost like if God created the world, who created God? So in scientific terms, we're asking what is the cause? If you say there is a cause that created everything, that brought everything into effect, then the question is infinite. Where will you stop asking what is the cause for that cause? What is the cause for that cause? So in order to make it more relevant, this statement is in order to cause everything else to come into existence, there must be something called uncaused, because only and then you can stop asking the question, what caused the cause? What caused the cause? And this argument says that uncaused thing that caused everything is God, must be God. Now, in order to understand why we say there must be an uncaused thing to cause something, we must ask these questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there universe why is there universe at all first in the first place? This is based on the idea of causation. When you ask why is there something rather than nothing, then it gives you a reason as to ask what caused it, why, what is the reason? The law of cause and effect. Example, what caused your parents? Then you say your parents, grandparents. What caused your great parents? Then the cycle goes on, the chain goes on. Where will you end it? Parents, where will you end it? It has to, until we track to some infinite time. If you go on like this, where is the end? So this logic must end somewhere so that it makes sense. If evolution were to be true, we come from monkeys, fish, so-called celled amoeba. That leads us to the first known, for example, people believe in, thank you. When we do creation and evolution, we will go into details, but for the argument's sake, I put this here. If you believe in evolution, that we came from monkeys, and if you go to even before monkeys, single cell amoeba, and even before you go, we come to the Big Bang theory. Now, the question is, then the question arises, what caused the Big Bang? Now, every scientist stops there at the Big Bang. It is because there's no cause for that one. What caused it? We will study when it comes to creation, but as of now, there's no explanation to it. If we rejected infinite regression, that means universe always existed. The chain of events can't go on forever. Instead, there must be a first cause which cannot be part of the universe. That means if you think of there is a cause for everything, there must be a first cause that is not part of the universe, that can make the universe. For example, man, whatever you make on this earth, you must be a part of it. There's no way man can go out of the earth to make something in the earth. Impossible. Only a person who transcends beyond time and space can do that. So this argument says there must be a first cause that cannot be a part of the universe. If you create a universe, you can't be in the universe and create the universe. Was it Archimedes who said, if you take me outside the earth and make me stand somewhere, I can weigh the earth and tell you what is the weight of the earth? Not possible. How can you go out of the earth and try to weigh the earth? I don't know. Anyway, similar like that. So it is not part of the universe, then it must, so it must be not part of the world or universe. If it is not part of the universe, then it must not be physical. Why? Not time bound, not caused. Anything that's not part of the world must not be limited to time because it's not part of the world. Imagine if you are in the world, creating something in the world, but you don't belong to the world, the earth, I mean, then you cannot be a physical because you can't see anything physical as big as the earth. It's not even time bound, nor even it caused in the earth. It must be caused outside the cause that has happened. So if it is not physical, then it must be spiritual. There's only two realms, physical and spiritual. If it can't be physical because universe is so big, there can't be something that is bigger than the universe. So in physical terms, so it is not physical. Then because only two realms exist, physical and spiritual, then it must be spiritual. If it is not time bound, then it must be eternal. If this thing that is the cause for the entire universe is not time bound, because the time is not limited to this thing, then if it is not time bound, then it is eternal. If it is not caused, then it must be necessary, uncaused. Therefore, the first cause, this eternal, this spiritual, this is which is not time bound, this which is not caused, the world doesn't know what it could be. They have no explanation. But as believers, we know all those things fit into God. God is not physical. God is not bound by earth or sky or planet or solar system or nothing. He's beyond. God is not bound by time. God is not bound by any cause that we will study in 2 weeks' time. So they may not call it God, but we call that thing which is spiritual, which is not bound by time, which is not caused, can be clearly attributed to what we call God, who is the cause for the entire universe. Look at this scholar who says there are things that are in motion, that are caused or contingent. Contingent means their existence depended on something else. These things require something else to move, cause, create them, and so on. Anything you take on this earth that man has made it, there must be something for them to work, something that's behind them that makes them work. So this chain of movement, causation, contingent can't be on indefinitely. Eventually, you have to arrive at something that existed, which is unmoved, move, uncaused, cause, uncreated being. And according to Thomas Aquinas, that uncaused, unmoved, uncreated being is what we call God. That's the third argument, cosmological. The final argument is called moral argument, which means the argument from moral order. What is true to you is not true for me. This is how we think today, postmoderns. Your culture is different from my culture. Your values are different from my values, isn't it? All of us here are not from same culture, not from same background, not from same values. We all have different values. What I understand in one way, you may take it in a different way. That's how. But there is something that's principally same for the entire universe, irrespective of what culture you come from, what race you come from, what values you are raised under. For example, language is arbitrary. Language is arbitrary. Why? What you name is what you identify. That's what the language does. For example, laptop can be called a pen. For example, whoever, let me say this, I have an iPad with me. When they made this iPad, if they have named it as pen, well, all of us would be calling it as pen. That's what the language. That's why we call it arbitrary. What it is called, it is what we understand it to be. But when it comes to morality, but morality is anchored in the character of God. When it comes to language, it changes based on how man understands, how man puts things in its place to make people understand. But when it comes to morality, it is anchored in the character of God. Why? There is no consistency in the commonality of language, isn't it? The same language we use, the same words means different things in different ways. Even in English, different words mean different to different people, the way they understand the language. But when it comes to morality, but there is complete consistency in the commonality of morality. When it comes to morality, there's consistency across language, across culture and values. How? Axiological argument from Greek, which means value, worth, or study, is the philosophical study of value. It includes questions about the nature and classification of values and about what kind of things they value. Morality is what they say, the way we live. Every culture throughout history has had some form of law, no matter whether it is written or not written. You cannot find any culture, any race, any tribe, any people who say they have no law at all. It may not be written, but there are some laws that govern their lifestyle, no matter how primitive they are and they seem to be. For example, everyone has a sense of right and wrong. That's why we call it moral law. Murder. Which community would accept murder? Which tribe, which value people, or whatever, which lying, stealing, and immorality, as much as the morality of people is diminishing now, and all sorts of laws are coming. But still, the basic principle of morality, you cannot attack, you cannot change, because that is almost like put into human life, the moral value. For example, few things is said: murder, lying, stealing, and immorality are rejected almost universally. You can't accept them. Where did this sense of right and wrong come from, if not from a holy God? Okay, where did this come from, if not from a God? If the world is the world that we existed, if we believe in evolution, it happened by chance. Can you think of something that man made that has no purpose attached to it, that has no meaning to why he made. Think of something that man made, that he just made for the sake of fun, that it has no meaning. I'm wearing my shirt. When man thought of making a shirt, he had a purpose to cover the nakedness of man. I'm wearing glasses. When they thought of making these glasses, it is to enhance my sight. When the watch is made, it enhance my time sense. Whatever you see, anything that you see around you that has been made by man, you will always see not only there is a designer, which is a man, but there's a purpose for which that has been made. Nothing came into existence by chance and has no purpose. So morality is saying, where did this sense of right and wrong came? If you believe in evolution, then you can't believe in morality because there is no purpose. No scientist will say Big Bang has a purpose. It just happened. Now, 10 commandments, what we actually believe. As believing Christians, let's get this clear. They are commandments, they are not options. And they are across all cultures. Nobody will deny any of them. Sabbath, of course, holy time, people may Sunday, people may Saturday, that's different. But the laws that govern human life, nobody would deny. They may not like them, but they are the principles that are a moral law that came from God. So morality can only be explained in the context of God and his character. There's no other way. The only way to explain the purpose of the shirt that I'm wearing is only in the context of a designer that was behind this. Otherwise, you just can't take up and don't know what it is, who made it, why they made it, if you don't know what it is and who is it who made it. So that's the argument. Now the question is, does it really matter? Do you have arguing about whether God exists or not? Does it really matter? What is the point? You just live your life. Does it make any difference if I know there is God or not? Because even if God is there, I don't think he's helping me. He doesn't bother. If God is there, as we suggested, why all this chaos? Look at the chaos in this world. There's more harm than good. In the name of Christ, how many mad things have been done? You know, more people were killed in the name of religion, Christianity. More wars were fought in the name of Christianity. What's the point? Does it matter whether God exists or not? How do you answer this question? Does it really matter? It matters, because if you don't believe, then there's 4 questions that you have no answer, which are vital to human life. You can't find an answer to these 4 questions if there is no belief of God or not. What are those questions? Number 1, origin. Where am I from? If you don't believe there is a designer, if there is a God or not, then you can't even prove where you are from. Science can't prove where you're from. They can tell you what brought you, or you came from monkeys or this or that, but where is your origin? Where am I from? Why am I here? What's the purpose? Ask a scientist, a philosopher, what's the purpose of human life? There is no answer. Because in the creation itself, there is no purpose. So what's the point of man? So outside God belief, you can't find a meaning to who you are, why you are here. Then morality, how should I live? If things just existed by chance, just came out like that, then where is morality part? Who brought this morality of right and wrong if that everything is by chance? How should I live? Who should tell you? When there is no origin and meaning to life, who even there to tell you how you should live? And final question, what is your destiny? This is key to us as Christians. Where am I going? Ask a scientist or a philosopher who is an atheist who believes in evolution. What is the destiny of man? Find out what the answer they would be giving. Ask these 4 questions and try to get an answer from them and see if they really make sense of these questions. You can only answer these 4 questions and find a purpose and meaning to human life only when there is a belief of a God. So we have seen 4: ontological, teleological, and cosmological and moral. These are the only way that can make sense of understanding God. Next week we come here. Finally, we will look at what actually Bible says. Let me make this statement. Bible doesn't prove there is God. But at the same time, Bible doesn't also prove that there is no God. We have to find the evidence as it is in the way we can understand this supernatural being. We will look at that next week. Please, if you have not watched the first and second part, please go to my YouTube channel, Pastor Mohan Rao Abbadasari. Watch them so that you have a comprehensive understanding of what we are trying to say when it comes to does God exist. God bless. I will stop the recording.